kind of awkward to me with that music.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. This is our Washington State University Strategic and Operational Excellence Committee. So if you're in the right room, great. If you're not, it's okay. We're glad to have you here. My name is Marty Dickinson, and I am, I guess I am the chair of the board. So it's my first meeting, and I'm excited to be here and humbled to be sitting in this seat. So with that, I'm going to just turn it to Kirk to speak about a couple things just logistically and meeting-wise, and then we'll get into the heart of the agenda.
Excellent, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fall semester on the Pullman campus. So what a beautiful day in the Palouse, and it's great to have everybody with us, and it's great to be meeting in person. So first thing I'd like to do is just recognize and introduce Ellen Taylor, who is serving as our interim vice president for student affairs for this year, and I know you'll hear from Ellen later. So anyway, congratulations, Ellen. Thank you for stepping in this leadership role, and look forward to spending more time with you and the board over the course of the next couple of days. One of my goals since I've been at WSU has continued to be as open and transparent as possible about university finances, where we are with athletics, all of those types of things. And that certainly applies to board meetings as well. And this last week, we've got a lot of inquiries from several members of the media. The Daily Evergreen wrote a really nice editorial this morning about the need for our meetings to be open and accessible. Some of our faculty leaders, I had a discussion yesterday with an elected official about what we were going to be doing with our Regents meetings. And I just want to tell everybody, we scrambled this week to make sure we could stream as much of this meeting as possible. And we have, this afternoon when we have the breakout committees, we just weren't able to get the technology in place for those. They'll still be available via phone and those types of things. We won't be streaming. By the November meeting, though, everything will be streamed. People will be able to see all of it. Our materials are always posted well in advance. So when people want to see PowerPoint slides, those kind of things, those will still be out there like they always have been. But I think, what we did is we returned to pre-pandemic protocols for in-person meetings. And I think one of the things that happened in COVID, people liked the fact that they could look at their device and actually see what we're doing in the discussion as opposed to just hearing it. So I appreciate everybody bringing that forward. I want to make sure that we always are doing things and operating in a way that our constituents, the folks that fund us, the people who work here, feel that they can see what's going on, hear what's going on, and just be an active member of our community helping us move forward. So I appreciate all the things that people have written and all the comments that I've gotten. And I just want everybody to know we're taking it seriously. And by November, we should be in great shape for all of our committee meetings and things like that. So with that, Marty, I'll turn it back over to you, and looking forward to a great day and a half.
As am I. So I'm very excited, but I would like to just take a quick moment before we jump in and just go around the table here, if we could, and introduce ourselves, because we do have a couple of new faces and new individuals that are joining our Board of Regents that we're very excited about. So Dave, I think I'll start with you, and we'll just work this way, if that's okay.
I take it you want us to turn these buttons on and make these mics work. Is that correct?
Yes, I think. Yeah, just remember they're hot when you're rolling your eyes at me in a couple minutes. So
yeah, Dave, yours doesn't work. So
I actually have control. I'll just shut people's mics off.
Okay, I understand. Well, my name is David Turnbull, and I'm currently serving as the faculty representative here on the Board of Regents. And for those of you who may not know me, I teach over in the School of Music here at Washington State University as well.
I'm Enrique Cerna. I'm a regent, and I became a regent in March of 2020. I'm very happy to be back here on the campus.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeanette Ramos, and I am still under a year. So I find myself saying I'm still new. So I look forward to meeting all of you.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Chilton, Provost and Executive Vice President, and I'm no longer new. It's been 14 months, so really great to be here. Thank you.
And your other title?
The honeymoon's over.
Oh, yes. Well, maybe I'll let Kirk say that. I don't know what title I have right now. What's
Okay.
the official?
Kirk Schultz, President, Washington State University. I'm in my 6th year. It's hard to believe it's gone by that quickly, and I appreciate everybody here. Elizabeth, as many of you saw the announcements, and this is her first Regent meeting where she's also our Chancellor Designate here for WSU Pullman as part of One WSU. So anyway, thank you.
Marty Dickinson, Chair of the board. In my everyday life, I am the Chief Marketing Officer for STCU in Spokane, Washington. I graduated from Washington State University in 1991. Cannot believe that. Pretty excited to just be able to continue leading and serving Washington State University.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Keohokalole Shower. I joined the board one meeting after Marty in 2018, and just so proud to be part of the Coug Nation and to see so many students on campus today. Pretty exciting, great vibe. Love to be here.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm Brett Blankenship. I started my term on the board roughly the same time President Schultz was appointed. So our term on the board is about the same. And in my everyday life, I run a wheat farming enterprise out in Washtenaw, Washington.
Good morning. I'm Laura Powell, and I am feeling very old today because I started in March of 2014. So anyway, I'm a retired scientist, and just really love being on the board. And it's been a great experience, and look forward to a few more years before I expire.
Before your term.
Hello, my name is Shane Wright, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm a student regent for this academic year, and I'm a student here in Pullman studying cultural studies and social thought and education at PhD program here. I'm very excited to be serving on the board and to be learning and representing students this year.
And Shane, are you on the Vancouver campus? Is that correct?
It's a Pullman program.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Thank you. And then we also have Regent Redmond, who is zooming in with us. So I'm just going to turn it to Heather to introduce herself.
Hi, so sorry I can't be with you all. You look great, and loved that you all made it to Pullman. So Heather Redmond, and I'm one of the regents, and I actually don't remember which year I was appointed, so I should probably look that up so I can be more official. But thank you all for including me via Zoom.
Thank you, Heather. We're glad to have you. Okay, we are going to jump right in to our agenda here. The first thing on our agenda is the enrollment management discussion. Oh, yes. Yeah.
One of some of the feedback we got from the regents last year was that the board would like to be more involved and engaged in some of our longer term planning, what types of things that we were thinking, what types of things were important for WSU to do. Because in previous years, we would sort of get into the committees and have 15 minutes to talk about enrollment management or our diversity, equity, and inclusion work or marketing and what we're doing as a university to build our brand, those types of things. And it just wasn't sufficient enough for really open dialogue and discussion. So one of the things that we did this year is specifically targeted Thursday mornings to have a couple-hour session with different kind of key topics that we think are really important for our regents and our board to be really engaged with and have really open dialogue about what we're thinking, where we're going, things like that. So this is something new for us to try in this particular style and format. And before we have Saichi come and talk, that is the reason that we're meeting earlier. And the reason we're meeting Thursday morning is the idea for the first session is not to have a lot of business items, but really focus around some long-term things and the board's engagement in helping us do what we need to do moving forward. So Saichi happened to be the inaugural, he drew the short straw, and really appreciate his willingness to kind of kick this off for this academic year. So.
Well, I guess, yes, Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
I'm just going to
please, thank you.
introduce him if I will. and then let him take the mic. So I'm very happy to introduce Vice Provost Saichi Oba. Saichi has been with us for 10 months approximately, and he is our first full-time Vice Provost for Enrollment Management in WSU's recent history. And he has brought a really strong system view to the work that he's done, as well as he and his team have really reached out. It's a collaborative approach across many units. Anyone who has met Saichi leaves the meeting saying that he has been a breath of fresh air in terms of our enrollment management approach, and really a strategic thinker. So today what he has to present to you is, something we've all been asking, and a lot of the Regents been asking: how is enrollment going? This is probably the number one question that most academic leaders at higher education institutions are asking, because getting our students here and having them stay and succeed is the engine that runs where the WSU and any other institution. So he's going to give us an update on where we are for fall 2021. But more importantly, share a bit of his vision for our strategy for enrollment in fall of 2022 and beyond. So Saichi, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for those kind words. And hello to the Regents. I recall meeting you in June. I think Shane was the only new person here that wasn't at that meeting. And thank you for letting me be the first speaker here in your Thursday mornings. I hope that after I'm done, you still choose to have this as a Thursday morning activity. I'm going to start with something I just read this morning. It isn't planned on my slides, but one of my team sent me an article that said the latest numbers are in from 2019 to 2020 across the country. Higher ed lost 661,000 students. Talk about a wake-up call. Now, of course, it's last year's numbers, but the hangover of COVID will continue for several years. And I don't mean to start our discussion on such a downer, but keep that in mind as the bigger context as we begin to talk about enrollment management over the next several years. So I will tell you, it's been 9 months and 2 days since I was hired. And the only reason I know that really well is because my hire here for my family and I was a momentous occasion. And so that's why I know exactly when I was hired. I have 3 things to do today on the agenda. And the first is to go over fall 21 with you. We'll look ahead at fall 22. And then, as Elizabeth said, we'll share a few thoughts on system-wide enrollment management. All right, where we started, where we landed, and what we learned. And here is the Cliff Notes version. We started under COVID-19, we landed under the Delta variant, and we learned a great deal. 2021, or the cycle that began for 2021, really starts about August for us, August of last year. And inauspicious is how we began. We chose to implement a new application system. We raised our application fee by about 40%. Starting any of those things in a new cycle sort of asks for some trouble. Starting both of them in the same cycle, you are almost guaranteeing you're going to have some trouble. We did lose some applications over the course of the year. At one point, we were about 20% down in applications. Eric Godfrey, who was the previous executive director of enrollment management, and Elizabeth called me in November, so before I even started, and said, we need to talk to you about some things that are sort of shaping up this fall. And so this was November of last year, and I got on the phone, and Eric had the unfortunate job of letting me know, hey, we're about 15% behind already. Welcome to WSU. In the intervening months, we gained quite a bit of ground. We ended the cycle about 10% down over a 3-year average. So we cut it in half. But the reality is, whether it was the application, the new application, or the application fee, we were living under sort of the specter of COVID-19. And the disruption to students' lives in high school, family finances, and just the uncertainty that brought is really sort of the root cause of why we ended about 10% down. I'm going to go through our admissions funnels with you just so you can see how this data rolls down onto the campuses. And I'm going to spend more time on the system view than each of the campus, but I am going to go through the campus views as well. And I'll point out some data elements that I think are really special as you look at how the campus funnels are working. So here we are at the system level. These are freshmen only. At the very top are prospects. So these are students that we have identified, but they have not expressed direct interest yet in a campus. That 157,000 is a little more than we had in 19. It's less than we had in 18. For this year, I can tell you we're trying to increase that by about 10,000. 60% of our prospects roll into the inquiry stage. And then to reach there, a student has to make a direct expression of interest in the university. So we may see them at a high school, they may respond to a campaign, but about 60% move down the funnel. 20% of our inquiries apply for admission. Now that number may seem small, but think about the application process or the student's process, right? They are going to apply to an institution that they believe they can be admitted to. That 90,000, they're going to start sort of self-selecting themselves in the schools they're looking at. So we, on average, have about 20% of our inquiries move to the applicant stage. And then from there, about 85% of our students who apply, we will admit. Now that number may seem high, but remember, by the time somebody applies to us, they have a good sense if they're admissible or not. And then as a system, we move about 30% of them into the confirmed stage. And confirmation for us is the student places a deposit to reserve their space at WSU. 83% of our students enrolled this fall, so that's the 4,007 number you see there. I'm going to go to Tri-Cities next. And before I start talking about the Tri-Cities, a couple of things. These funnels are not passive, okay? So there's no gravity at work in these funnels. Students must be worked through each stage to get to the enrollment stage. And what I mean by work is campus staff communicate, work with these students, send out messaging campaigns to help them understand how we want them to move through the funnel. Here, I would draw your attention to 3 and then 4. The Tri-Cities does a tremendous job of moving admitted students into the confirmation stage. The system, it's 30%. The Tri-Cities, it's 55%. They also do a very good job of moving them into enrolled. For global, a couple of notes here. Global includes their transfer students in their funnel. So this number includes freshmen and transfer. Students who inquire at global tend to apply. Almost 40% apply for admission. Again, that's better than the system, which is about 20%. The other thing, let me point out, we start the funnels on the campuses at the inquiry stage. So these students have expressed some interest in the university. Also, like Tri-Cities, Global does a really good job of once a student has applied and been admitted, they get them into the confirmation stage. We need students in the confirmation stage because that helps us understand what enrollment will ultimately look like. Vancouver, here I would tell you that Vancouver, like Global and like the Tri-Cities, does a really good job of once they admit somebody, moving them into the confirmed stage, right? 55% of their admits will move into confirmation. Again, the system, 30% is what we do on average. Pullman, this won't be a surprise to anybody, but Pullman's data is about plus or minus the system. So it's within 1% either way. Pullman does a really good job of moving confirmations to enrolled. About 85% of students who confirm enroll at Pullman. And that's the other reason why you want to get your students to the confirmation stage. That's the stage in which we then can get them to enrollment.
Saichi, can you, just that statement you made there of doing a good job of keeping them from confirmed to enrolled, what are those things that Pullman might be doing that perhaps, our Vancouver or our Tri-Cities campus is not able to do, or what are those gaps there?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it also illustrates, I think, some unique differences among the campuses. A confirmed student at Pullman then begins to hear from other offices. Housing, for example, is huge in the life of a first-time student. So communications from student affairs begins to go to those students. Orientation is mandatory, and so that too begins a whole slew of communications. And so you still have enrollment management working with them. Now you have student affairs and new student programs. And that sort of, that confluence of effort begins to move people into the enrolled. These last two.
Can I ask a question as well? Sorry,
Please.
a little hard to break in from the Zoom screen. So Marty's question sparked a question in me as well, or maybe this is something for us to talk about later. But there's a lot of conversation now about housing, sort of in the general U.S. and because some of our campuses are in areas where housing is scarce, I wonder if more of an emphasis on housing in some of our other campuses might be an interesting way to not change people's minds. We don't want people to come to the school because they're looking for a place to live, but to help them make their decision more rapidly and give them a different deadline to deal with, as you're sort of suggesting Pullman may do. So just a thought. I know we're thinking about more residential options on some of our other non-Pullman campuses, but that may end up being a real strategic advantage for us.
Thank you, Regent Redmond. Building housing is an expensive endeavor, but adding it to sort of how we help students enroll, that cost, whether we have housing or not, helping them with their basic needs, I think follows from your comment. So I'll continue now and finish this funnel discussion. This is Spokane, and Spokane is only transfer activity. Here are a couple of things that are really different about Spokane. By the time a student makes an inquiry into Spokane, they're likely going to apply. So about 75% of students who inquire also apply for admission. Remember the system, it's only about 20%. Now here's another difference. Those students who apply, only about a quarter of them are going to be admitted to Spokane. Now this makes complete sense because of the programs that are in Spokane. The system, we admit 80% or more, Spokane about 25%. That number that's repeated, that's not a mistake. If you're admitted to a Spokane program, you're going to hang on to your golden ticket. You are going to confirm your spot as soon as you can. Now, not all of them show up. The number to really focus on at the bottom there is the 80 new to WSU. So about 70% of new confirmed students make it in Spokane. And then the last funnel I'll go over is Everett. And like several of the campuses that I've shared, Everett does a really good job of moving admitted students into confirmed, right? That is the key for enrollment, is you have to get people to confirm so that you can work with them to go through orientation and then enroll. And Everett does a really good job in there to confirmation to enrolled. Now, where did we land? Before I talk about some of the numbers on this screen, let me share that 6 weeks before the term ended, I began sending to Cabinet a weekly enrollment report. And this was suggested by several groups that we needed to get ahead of perhaps a decrease that was going to show up. There was all kinds of speculation that we were down 10% and faculty were wondering what we were doing. And so the Faculty Senate Executive Committee actually met with me and suggested that we begin sharing information on a more timely basis. So 6 weeks out, I started sending out an enrollment report. And the first report I sent, we were 8.5% down. And then each subsequent week, we gained a little. And so by the last report, which was 1 week before the term start, we were 3.9% behind the previous year. And then what happens here is on the 10th day, we take a snapshot of our data. That's our census date. Institutional research then takes that snapshot and begins to work the data that becomes our official numbers. And so what you're looking at here is a part of the official numbers. So there we are. We ended the year 4.2% behind last year. For new freshmen, we are 4.4% behind last year. And for new transfers, we are about 5% behind for new transfers. I'm going to go over just a couple of more statistics on this page, but let me just share. Anytime an enrollment manager is presented the final numbers for a semester, and they see, and I see, sort of how narrow the gap was between this year and last year, you can't help but wonder, how did we let this slip away, or how did what could we have done differently? I was sharing with my team that there's 184 students different between fall to fall. That is a large lecture class at Pullman. And, it's a dangerous thought process, but believe me, enrollment managers do this all the time. And the reality is this year, everyone worked really hard to get the class we have. Not just enrollment management, across the university, people did everything they could to help students return to campus. I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about. In mid-spring, we realized that our freshmen from fall 20, they were not signing up for registration for fall 21 in nearly the number that we anticipated. And so led by student affairs, supported by enrollment management and other offices, academic departments, about 70 people began calling hundreds of students. And the net result was that class has returned to Pullman at 83.5%, 2 percentage points higher than the year before. That's remarkable. First of all, to have almost 84% of your class return is outstanding. But to know where we started and to know how we finished and the effort that went into that, that's really the takeaway for me. Two numbers I'll point out on the very top. Percent minority and then percent Washington resident. COVID-19's impact has been most devastating to students of color, students of low financial means, first-generation students. And so to see that at least minority student populations increased by 0.5% is somewhat gratifying. Wish it could have been more. But at least we held our own there. The same with Washington residents. I have only worked in public higher education. I don't know of any lawmaker or any executive in higher ed and the public that does not always think about residents first in their state. You always want to see residents come back to you or come to you in higher numbers. So I'm going to move on, and we will wait. Yes, Chair. Excuse me, former Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question. It's a hypothetical one, because I'd seen a report in a national publication of, for years we've been sensitive to minority numbers and encouraging women to pursue professional careers. This article I saw was the opposite. They were alarmed at how few males were in incoming classes. Our numbers appear, reasonably level from prior years. I didn't know if you'd noticed anything, or if anything that the board should be in tune with on that trend.
Regent, I would say that this topic actually comes and goes in higher ed. 20 years ago, the dearth of male students in higher ed was really prevalent. In my former system in Alaska, that was of great concern for us. And there was all kinds of factors that fed into that, but we were always looking at that. So I would say that this comes and goes. I think you're absolutely right that WSU is on track, and the numbers are consistent, I think, from year to year. That's important. And I also think 54% with women is I think we're doing well in that. If we thought we needed to increase the male population here, I'm sure we could figure out strategies and perhaps what campuses we would want more students on. But I would tell you right now, I don't think this raises really any concerns at this point for me.
Sachi,
Yes.
I have a question for you. This is a longer term discussion in terms of strategy. And I know in the near term, we've got to muscle through COVID, but what are the features of WSU that correlate to making those numbers? And so, there's that saying, build on your strengths.
Yeah.
So is it academics? Is it athletics? What are those things that from a strategic standpoint, as we consider investments, that you could shine a light on?
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's a very involved and detailed question. And unfortunately, I'm going to not give it probably the depth it needs. But here is my shot at it. You have to start with academics. That has to be the focal point of any strategy to increase enrollment. It has to be your academic programs. Now, do you have all the academic programs that you need for the students that are coming to you? That's really a good strategic question. Are they in the right campuses? That's another really good strategic question. But you have to start with academics, and WSU is well poised to lead with academics. It just so also happens that, in this campus in particular, there is a robust student experience. And that's really nice to be able to also follow up with, that not only are you attending a world-class institution because of our academics, because of our research, because of our faculty, but we have a robust student life experience that encompasses a great deal. So just really short, Regent, I would say any strategy that we're looking at has to begin on the academic side.
So just to maybe follow up on that though, are we in a place, and I 100% agree, you have to start with academics, but have we asked the question of our students as to why they're coming to Washington State University and perhaps why they're choosing Vancouver, Pullman? Do we have intent of kind of trying to learn a little bit more about that so that we know we're hitting the mark in the right areas of academics, and then also enhancing the other components that layer onto a decision?
We do, Chair Dickinson. Right now we have, it's not back to us because they still have to work through all the data, but we hired a vendor, the acronym is NRCCUA, and they surveyed for us all of our new students for this coming year, and all those questions are asked in that. The second set of the surveys we're doing with the same company are all the students that did not enroll with us. And so what we're trying to look for is, where are the responses in common, where are they wildly different, and what will that tell us in terms of how we attract students? I would say what we don't have, and perhaps you were alluding to this, is I haven't seen a current student survey. And maybe that is something that we should invest in. What do our current students say? And perhaps Regent Wright might, think of that too as one of the features of his time. What do we know from our current students, and what do they tell us?
Again, this, good, bad, or indifferent for you in this particular topic. My expertise is marketing and branding. And so that funnel, we operate our whole world in that funnel, right? Of consideration to actually becoming a true member. And I'm constantly trying to get at, why do we lose them from consideration? Where do we lose them? And what's the break point there? And then try to build the brand and our strategy for that window. And so again, is that perhaps something you are looking at, Sachi, for like future, because if we're talking strategy, right, these are the components of true strategy, of digging in and understanding that student that was committed or is right there to be committed, but is laying out 3 universities that have given them the letter. What is it that causes them to say, yes, I'm going to be a Coug, or you know what, I'm going to go this route.
So if you can think back to the system funnel, moving confirmations into enrollment is really a strength of WSU, right? It's at about 83%. 8 out of 10 students enroll with us. Now, it actually was higher, I believe, 2 years ago. And so what we teased out of the last 2 years is the way we organized our orientation program changed rapidly under COVID-19. It used to be in person, which was a reinforcing strategy. We had them at Pullman. And so we had them on campuses when orientation happened. But summer orientation was really a Pullman strategy. The last 2 years, we've seen declines in orientation. And so we know it's the linchpin to our enrollment. We have to get them back into orientation. Now, ideally, we would have them in person because we believe that was the strength of the program. And when I say strength, I mean, you're up at 90%. That's amazing. That's 9 out of 10 now are actually enrolling after going through confirmation and enrollment with you. I'm sure there are people who love 100%, but you know what? I'll take 90%, and I'll work on the other 10. But so we know that is the linchpin, Regent Dickinson, is moving them from confirmation to enrollment. And the last 2 years have told us the virtual orientations have not been as welcoming by our students.
I had a question about the transfer students. When I think transfer students, I think from community colleges predominantly. I had the opportunity to speak with the president of our local community college last weekend, and I was dismayed to hear that their enrollment for last year was down 10%. This current year, down 15%, which is not a good trend, or it doesn't bode well for transfer students. So I don't know whether there's a broader base than I'm aware of, but if that's mirrored in other community colleges around the state, then that's a very serious concern.
It is, Regent. It's very serious. I believe it's Clark College in Vancouver has experienced just some horrendous decline over the last maybe 7 or 8 years, to the tune of about 50%, I think is the number I saw. That is just devastating because obviously Vancouver and Clark are partners. And so you can see how that would affect not only Vancouver, but other four-year universities as well. Interestingly, I don't have it up here, but Pullman did a pretty good job with transfer activity this fall. And I mean literally just the Pullman campus. Transfer activity around the system was sort of hit or miss, but in particular, Pullman did a pretty good job. I mean, it's still a decline, but it was mitigated quite dramatically from where it began. Transfer strategies overall are going to be important in the future here. We have a project right now with enterprise systems, so the IT folks, that will produce essentially a portal, a site for students to come in to see how their credits will transfer, save the information, we'll move them into our CRM, we'll work with them. So there'll be sort of inquiries at that point, we'll work with them. But we're looking forward to that bit of technology that we've been lacking for the last several years.
I have a couple questions just in terms of overall strategy, and you might be getting to this. If you are, then I can wait. I'm curious about the role of Pullman Enrollment and the other system-wide campuses. So for instance, I think Marty mentioned this, just in terms of branding and marketing, each community is so different, and a strategy to enroll students as freshmen and transfer students needs to look and feel different. So I was curious if you could speak a little bit to the differences in each campus's approach to being able to increase enrollment, and then the support and or collaboration with Pullman.
Thank you, Regent. I cannot speak to the exact differences among the campuses. I will tell you, I completely agree, though, with your comment that the campuses have to own that part of the process. Recruitment is it's a relationship-based activity, and that has to remain close to the student, so at the campus level. Those funnels I was sharing, when I would say things like the Tri-Cities does a really good job of moving admitted into confirmed, that is where they're applying their strategy to get students there. And it's also probably why some of those campuses have, double what the system at large does. It's because they've found something that works with their population. And, I need to learn what that is, but right now I'm focused on just some larger things. But I would tell you that maybe this is the most important part, and maybe it's for the people behind me, the chancellors in particular. I completely believe that they need to own that part of the process.
If I may, I think it's fair to say that enrollment management has been very much Pullman-centric for a long time. And what Saichi brings, and I think he's going to share in a slide or two, a vision for how we can do exactly what you're talking about, Regent Shower. So maybe if we get into that, you can see a little more of the vision.
Saichi, just for purpose of time and timekeeping, probably another 20 minutes in our discussion, if that works. So.
Oh, absolutely. But we want time for questions, right? So that includes that.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
I'm going to put this into overdrive and really kind of go through this next slide, a couple of slides really quickly, what we learned, what we're doing differently, and then we'll get to the enrollment, system-wide enrollment management. So like other universities, we had to pivot to a virtual strategy last fall, and it's not a replacement. I think anybody who does this for a living would say the same thing. In particular for Pullman, not being able to bring students to campus, but I would say that for the system, not bringing students to campus really hurt. We have not had a campus visit program for over a year. We started in July and we had 4 sessions, Future Cougar Fridays, 1,200 students, 1,200 visitors, including students. So we know the need is out there. A couple other things, you can't falter out of the gate with your application. You just can't. We only have a 26-week cycle for applications. Every week counts. We average about 800 applications a week. If we string together 2 or 3 bad weeks, it's almost impossible for us to catch up. We are basically mitigating everything we saw wrong this past year with all of these strategies. The last one I would share, the retention. WSU does a really good job of retaining students. What I'm referring to is really sort of an incentive program to help students make it from one term to the next. And we're looking at programs that would say if you complete this many credits, you have financial need, you complete with this level of GPA, here's a grant to come back. And then we're looking at another program that would look just the same, but a higher credit hour threshold. And that one is aimed at helping people graduate sooner. So retention will be a focus or renewed focus for us. So here's what Elizabeth was alluding to, and I'll end with this. For those of you at the June retreat, this will look familiar. There's some changes though. The top 2 arrows on the left, we are trying to really define and refine Cabinet's role, and it's really as the final approval. They will take the proposals that the advisory group sends to them, and yes, it's being funded, or no, it's not, and no, send it back for more work. But really, that's the role for Cabinet. The advisory group, which is where all of the information from around the system comes in, which is where we vet, which is where the broadest spectrum of voices resides. So you have enrollment management professionals, faculty, staff, students, and they'll help set vision, direction, guiding principles. And that's really the key to system-wide enrollment management, is how you communicate across your system. That's it. If you can't communicate across your system, you can't get ideas in places where the ideas need to reside. And so that's what the framework does for us. It begins to help us get information out and in to this decision-making body here. The last thing I did is I put that sort of multi-directional arrow. It was my way of saying that the information is not one way. It doesn't come from the top only. It's not only going to come from the bottom. It's sort of multi-directional. And then the last thing I will share with you, and I shared this with you in June, it is by design that this framework rests on a data team. We have to do things that are data informed. One of the absolute killers of enrollment management is spending time and money on things that you have no locus of control over. And you spend money and time and realize that is not helping enrollment. So data helps you understand if it's going to have an impact on enrollment. Okay. I'm going to end there, Regent Dickinson, because I want to reserve at least 15 minutes for questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're just so fortunate to have you, and glad that you made that choice to move from Alaska to Washington. And really good discussion. Things that I think our regents have wanted to see and dig into a little bit, but we just always have to check the box, right? We're moving through the agenda very quickly. So opportunity to just engage Saichi here. And so, yeah, Dave.
I'd like to echo what she just said. On behalf of the faculty, we are very, very happy to have you here. The work that you and your team did coming into this fall is just tremendous. Thank you, Saichi. We're very fortunate to have you. When we look at these numbers up here, 4.2, 4.4, 5%, those actually look relatively good compared to what it could have been. Do you have any idea what other universities across the country are looking at in terms of lower enrollments and how we compare to those?
Thanks, Dave. Regionally, let me start. That all the universities in Washington had the exact same concern going into their cycle. And about mid-spring, we meet monthly, all the enrollment managers, and about mid-spring, all of us, while playing it close to the vest, also revealed the same concern was cropping up everywhere, and that was our confirmations were looking really good for fall, but that it was not materializing in orientation or even enrollment. And so everybody had the same sort of challenge before them. Students were making it into confirmation, but they weren't making it further. I know that two of the campuses, Eastern and Evergreen, have some real concerns about what their enrollment will be. I think Western is hanging on. The University of Washington has a different level of strategy in terms of how many they admit, and that's really how they sort of hold against any downturns. They keep a wait list that they can keep going back to fill their confirmations with. So regionally, I think everybody was in the same boat. I think when all the numbers come out, we won't be as bad as some, and there'll be a few probably that'll be a little above us.
I have a comment and a question. In the management system, clarity of the goal is really important. So if you can help us with that in terms of communicating near-term and long-term goals, then the entire community can pull together and align, right? And so that would be really cool to hear from you at some point in time. And then also the recognition. So kudos to you and your team for really trying to hit this hard and helping us with the strategic discussion. So however way we can help, but the communication, sharing the story, especially from the academic core, that would be super helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent. And the thanks goes to everybody. It's not just the team in enrollment management. This really, people pulled together, and that story I gave you is just a good example, but that was replicated. And I'm echoing other leaders who said the same thing, how hard people have worked to help students return. I didn't show a slide because I wanted to get to this discussion, but the last slide I showed has a comment about guiding principles and system-wide enrollment goals. And I'll just sum it up real quickly. The advisory group will be asked to submit a set of guiding principles on enrollment management to cabinet in December. And the reason that's important is because in the new year, those guiding principles will help us with the discussion of system-wide enrollment goals. You need to have guideposts, you need to have fence posts on the discussion of goals. And so those guideposts are what the first step will be. When I think of guiding principles, I think of things like these are non-negotiable. This is part of enrollment management. And one that comes to mind, whether or not it makes it in, I hope it does, but that we will be student-centered, right? That everything we do is to the success of a student. That should be an enrollment management guiding principle. And so once we establish those, once they're ratified by cabinet, then in the new year, we begin the really difficult discussion of setting system-wide enrollment goals. And those will be broadcast and shared.
This might be a question more for you, Kirk, but once those system-wide enrollment goals are established, then how will that trickle out to the business units that are in place to support and drive those goals? So how does marketing have a clear line of sight that one of their goals is to be serving the enrollment goal, and that recruitment, how is it all kind of rolling up to that ultimate number that we are going to try to hit? How does each business unit kind of get to that?
I would share Chair Dickinson that communications and marketing is right there. They do not have to be convinced of the value of increasing enrollment. They are partners in everything we do right now. I would say that sort of where I'm aiming for in terms of the system-wide goal, and then the next level would be probably the deans. I think maybe your question is going a little deeper, and I would say absolutely, but I'm not sure if I'm the one leading it. I think the deans might have to then carry this further. But my goal is to have the discussion with the system leadership, and then the campuses, obviously, because it's a system-wide goal. And then to me, the next level, at least for the vice provost, is how do we engage the deans in this discussion and in this goal-setting exercise?
If I look at our financial picture as an institution, we've done a really good job in a lot of areas, and clearly the drop in enrollment has caused some financial distress, that we've managed and worked, and we had money set aside for that. But I do think that when you talk about alignment of units, I think just about everybody knows that we've got to do a great job with enrollment. And that includes working with our faculty, because one of the questions that we got early on was, well, are you just going to allow all kinds of students here to get tuition revenue without regard to, are we recruiting the type of students that we think that we need to? So I just appreciate that Saichi is working with finance and administration, with our faculty leadership, with student leadership, with all these different groups, and he's bringing them all along around enrollment management. And so I think you're going to see a nice unified front here about those principles, what we need to do, and everybody's on board. So it's a great question, but I do think Saichi's attitude and his willingness to kind of work with everybody going along has gone a long ways to making this the best it's been since I've been here in terms of coordination, leadership, and focus.
Just your opinion, and again, since the board's role is to provide the infrastructure to succeed, how important on your retention or recruitment, and if the chancellors have an opinion on that, it'd be great to hear. But on-campus housing, how important would that be to some of our other campuses? Pullman has it, so is that one of our pieces of the puzzle that's holding some people from the growth numbers we're looking for?
Well, thank you for that question, Regent Blankenship. I don't think I can answer that question really well right now. I think the idea of housing on a campus is something that the chancellors probably have a better understanding of what's needed or what's possible, and how that might play toward their enrollment management goals or their enrollment goals overall. Um, I can tell you that obviously on this campus, it is a large part of the student experience. And when I was addressing Regent Dickinson as to why Pullman does a really good job of moving students from admitted to confirmed and to enrolled, I know it's because of the work that Residence Life does in bringing students on board. It's part and parcel. It's an expectation here. So I know for this campus, it's incredibly important.
Laura will go, and then Heather, I know you have a question, so we'll come to you as well.
I want to ask a question that regards treating the student truly as a customer. And I know you've heard stories about how enrollment management and so forth was structured in the past, which was very Pullman-centric, as was mentioned a few minutes earlier. There are students, as I'm sure you know, who want to go to college but are intimidated by a very large population. Others love the large population, and there's a lot of variables. Is there an effort going on amongst the campuses because our campuses are really quite different in a way, to really find the best fit for a student? As you know, because to me, it seems like if they are in some place that they really feel like is the best fit for them, whether it's curriculum, whether it's just size and community, that might really help in the overall enrollment as well as retention.
Thank you, Regent. Yes, fit is incredibly important, and I would include not only community or geography or size of campus. I would say things like financial fit. Does this work with me as a student right now, the campus I'm looking at? All of that is important. I would say the campuses do that right now. They have a good understanding. I mean, that's why they're able to move students from their confirmed into their enrolled. I would say you kind of threw me there for a minute when you said customer, student as customer, because, and I hope I don't have my supporters running for the hills, but I believe in that. I believe they are, in fact, customers of many of the services of the university. And so you do need to treat them with some deference and help them. Now, are they always right? Okay, maybe I'd have a debate about that, but I do believe you have to help them and you have to serve them.
So just to clarify, if let's say a student applies to Pullman, but in discussion with that student, they find that they really are better suited for Vancouver, Everett, or Tri-Cities, would they be referred to find out more information about those campuses?
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes. If that were the case, a student applied and the discussion was had with Pullman advisor, a Pullman admissions counselor, and really the aims of the student would be met at a different campus. That's exactly how the conversation would go.
Let me, before we go to Regent Redmond, I think I want to go back to something Saichi mentioned though in a slide at the bottom, and that's the data part of decision making, because what we tend to find is these urban legends will be out there about, well, students aren't allowed to move between campuses or something. And then we go dive in and find out we got less than 20 students out of 30,000 that this affects, but it's taken on a life of its own. So I think one of the important things is to use data to help us do this and find out, are there lots of students that are being not placed appropriately? What I find when I'm on the campuses, if I have to talk to a Tri-Cities student, they want to be in the Tri-Cities. They made that choice to be there because of that campus fit. And I almost never have a conversation. Somebody says, well, I really wanted to go to Pullman, but this was better. They'll say, I wanted to go here. And so I just think this is how we got to use that data to help us to make sure that we're not spending $100,000 on a problem that's not there. Or if it is there, then you say we better do a lot more investment to make sure we're putting people in the right place. Is that fair, Saichi?
Absolutely. One of the questions I was asked, my first meeting with, I believe it was Chancellor Netzhammer's cabinet, was we really want the ability for students to apply to more than one campus. So we are investigating that. And then I asked my staff, I'd like you to go back over the last several years and find out how many students have applied to more than one campus. Now, given it's a tough process now because there's really no way to do it, the student can figure it out. So on average, we have about 150 students a year who apply to more than one campus. Most of them apply to Pullman and then another campus. You know, that 150, you could look at it in a number of different ways. I think it's enough for me to say, we want to look at this, right? We want to unveil why it is students are doing this. And if it serves them, let's put in place a process that allows them to do this. But that's the data point.
Regent Redmond, turn it to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so curious about the role of chosen major. I know, anecdotally from UW and also from Stanford that if they could let everybody enroll as a computer science student who wants to, they could, balloon their enrollment considerably. And so I'm curious what kind of role that plays at WSU.
Thank you, Regent Redmond. I do know, I can validate that story about computer science at UW. That's making all the rounds in all the enrollment management meetings. But quite frankly, I'm not sure here if we have programs that are oversubscribed to the point where we need to manage our enrollment of them. Now, I'll set aside, I think, Spokane for just a moment, but I think in general, most of our baccalaureate programs are able to accommodate students. It's a matter of where they might enroll, maybe is the strategic question that we would have, right? Do we increase management students in Everett? Is that where we need to focus our time? Or is it here at Carson on the Pullman campus? So, but I haven't heard, and that attributed just to my not finding out if in fact there are some oversubscribed programs that we need to manage better in terms of how we admit or not.
I just wanted to speak to this question. This is something that all institutions face, as you point out, Regent Redmond, that there are some programs that are more popular. And if you look at the past, and I have, believe it or not, I think it was in my job talk, you look over the past 30 years at the popularity of computer science versus natural science versus humanities, those ebb and flow and go with basically correlate with the economy and what's going on in the world. And health sciences, I would include in this too. They tend to ebb and flow. And the challenge that universities have is that we can't move that quickly to what is popular today because we are hiring tenure track faculty who are often with us for quite a long time. And often students start out thinking that they want to go into field X or Y and actually discover something totally different. So as a comprehensive research university, we want to, on the one hand, be sensitive to what they are interested in coming in the door, but then also understanding that we need to support them throughout all the twists and turns, that they may end up in a very different place. And many of them do end up in a very different place. And we have to be able to accommodate both of those. The worst thing we could do would be to let them in and have classes that are so crowded or low quality, or the faculty can't give them the proper attention. And so they get their chosen initial major, but they're not having that high quality experience. So those are the many things I would just throw in that we need to balance.
Satya, I noticed that a couple of times you kind of pointed to the deans. What is it that the deans aren't doing that you want them to do, or you need from them, I guess?
Regent Cerna, I would say the reason I often bring my comments to the deans is because deans are the linchpin to the college, and the college and the chairs or the faculty. And that's why it isn't, I would say they are working really well. I'm able to meet with the council as part of the provost staff quite often, in fact, once a month at least. And I have found them to be absolutely engaging, very, very sophisticated in their approach to enrollment in their particular college. So please, my comments are only that my experience has told me Deans are incredibly important to the management of a university and the enrollment management of the college.
I wasn't trying to get you in trouble or anything. I was just wondering. Okay.
I just have a couple more comments. I know you're ready to move us along. Okay. Saichi, you have a big job, and this has been an awesome conversation, one that I think many of us have been anxious to have. So a couple of comments. The first is, I think Regent Redmond's discussion around housing is incredibly important and significant, especially if you think about the second largest campus being Vancouver and the lack of housing there. And so I'd love to see a discussion around the strategy relative to housing on the Vancouver campus. And I know that there's lots of different models about what that might look like, but I think that's got to impact our ability to increase enrollment. The second is there's been lots of conversations, and I think it's kind of ebbed and flowed into the finance discussion. It's been part of tuition, it's been part of enrollment, and that's around the use of waivers. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about that. Maybe not now, but just it continues to be something that gets brought up, but I don't completely understand. And then the third element that I was interested in is your comment around retention. It's not just recruitment, but it's also not losing students once we have them. And again, I would just emphasize, I think that's probably a different strategy on each campus, especially dependent on that housing piece and even the athletics, which I think just plays a different role depending on which campus you're on. So I know that's a lot. I'm loving this conversation. So I just have a lot of interest in how you continue to build out this program. Having not been here very long, there seems to be a lot of opportunity for just more of the strategic thinking. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your comments and your questions. Let me just touch on one of them, and that is this the waiver discussion. And I would tell you that the waiver discussion is part of the larger net tuition discussion. That's how it impacts WSU. And one thing that I've found over the 9 months I've been here is the willingness of the finance leadership to join in this discussion. Rather than simply say, you have to stop using waivers, they've been really good about helping understand the impact of the use of waivers on the net tuition at WSU. That is not common in higher education, that type of partnership at that level. Usually it's the description I gave you. It's the one way, stop using waivers. It's not a, we need to discuss this. We need to figure out a way forward that might utilize more foundation, less waivers. So that's one of the things that will help us moving into the future is that partnership already. And by name, I mean, that's Vice President Pearson.
Lisa, if I can, one opportunity that we're having lots of discussions on is because of our structure, a lot of our student retention work is we got a lot of great people working all over campus on student retention. But if you look at a lot of structures that we'll talk about, the student first, student success model, it's really a really collaborative effort between student affairs, academic affairs, and a lot of this. So one of the things I've asked, on the Pullman campus in particular, Ellen and Elizabeth to sit down and really kind of talk through what that could look like moving ahead. How can we take folks that may be in different units and kind of focus them all on one thing? And it's that the passion's there and people are doing excellent work, but sometimes you got two small groups instead of one larger one that's kind of focused. And so this is not a, get together and knock it out in the afternoon, but I just think that retention part, we realize we can do better, and some structural, the way we're put together may have some effects on that. So let's make sure that we're getting the right people in the room together, focusing on what can we do for student retention. Let's not worry about reporting structure as much. So I just think we're emerging that. Saichi's been an active part of this, and I think we're ready for it now. I'm not sure we were ready a couple years ago to have that same discussion. So I think the board should expect us to come back over the course of the year and saying, let me tell you what we're doing differently to affect student retention in a positive way. So great question.
Well, this has been an outstanding dialogue, and I appreciate the Regents' questions and engagement on it. And again, Saichi, thank you for your effort and your work on this. This is going to be really exciting and hard work, as we all will have a responsibility and some accountability to moving into what these numbers are going to look like and the goals that we're going to strive for as a system. So thank you very much for being here today.
Absolutely. Regent Dickinson, may I make one comment?
Yes.
Today, Wendy J. Peterson, her retirement celebration, and for those of you probably know Wendy better than me, but she was the director of admissions here for 38 years. And so we're going to celebrate with her this afternoon at Palouse Ridge. And, standing on the shoulders of giants is sort of how we move ahead. And Wendy was a giant here and also in admissions. I knew of Wendy even in Alaska. And so I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you for
because
sharing that.
We're all
That's
gonna
good for us
celebrate
to
with
know
her.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, you guys, we are going to take a 5-minute break and transition into our discussion around COVID and mitigation and just learning a little bit on how things are going on campus. So 5 minutes, 10:20 is when we will reconvene. Thanks. If we could get everybody to gather in and sit down, we'll get started. God, I feel like I'm in a lounge. All right, can we turn the lights down a little and the Turnbull effect.
We can get Dave and Brett to do it live next
I know.
time. So,
Yeah. Oh, you're Dave. All right, we're going to go ahead and start. So if you could please sit down. A lot of those are our chancellors out there. All right. Our next conversation that we're going to have is around COVID and COVID mitigation. And of course, there's really nothing to talk about in this space, right? But I'm going to turn it to President Schultz to introduce our two guests that will be kind of leading our conversation.
thank you. Let me just tee this up a little bit. I know for our regents, there's just lots of questions about what types of things we're doing and so on, and we'll get into that shortly. But one of the things that we did this last year as a leadership team is you have to get through a year of something like the pandemic. We did a little bit of self-evaluation and said, what worked well? What were some things that maybe we could have done differently? And what occurred, and everybody was working really hard to make this happen, is we just had come up with this really complex structure of different committees and things that you would probably not sit down and do it that way from the beginning if you were doing it. So kind of working with everybody, we decided to disband a lot of those specialized teams that we had stood up and sort of start with a blank sheet of paper. And if you will, put together a group of leaders and doers in each of the different areas across campus, and then ask these two fine folks to lead those particular efforts. So Haley Rupp is the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Office of the President, and she has done a lot of work on pulling it together. Joel Schwarzkopf is works with Cougar Health Services and leads that particular effort. And these two co-lead this. So, and they've got a group of people that represent virtually everybody on campus. And it's been much smoother. It's been quicker. We can turn on a dime. And I think it's just been a process improvement internally that you may not see, but I think has really allowed us to be much more responsive. And frankly, we had a lot of VPs involved and engaged, and a lot of the VPs had to do that plus everything else in their regular job. They've been able to back away, serve in an advisory capacity, and it's just worked really, really well. So I appreciate Joel and Haley, and I'll turn it over to you for a presentation.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Again, yeah, my name is Joel Schwarzkopf, he, him. I'm the Executive Director of Cougar Health Services here at the WSU Pullman campus. And I'm just going to take the mask off for a second so you can see my face. I want to call attention to something the President just said, which is really that we could not accomplish what we have over the last year and a half without such an amazing team of individuals. And though we'll be speaking often, I think, in the first person here over the next hour, what we're going to present to you reflects the hard work of not just dozens, but hundreds of individuals across the WSU system who've accomplished the COVID response. And when I say that, I mean not just the folks in Cougar Health, but the folks in facilities, the vice chancellors, the people in student affairs, in academics, right down to the level of every person teaching a class, of cleaning a classroom, and all the steps along the way that have been necessary to get us back to a full in-person experience for this fall. It's been a momentous lift. And I think a strain on all of us as we've come back, but it's been very exciting. As I looked out at the mall a few weeks ago during the first week of classes, it felt very weird to me. And I realized that it felt weird because it felt normal. And that this return to normalcy is something that has been an adjustment for all of us as we've progressed through the stages of grief, I think, and grappled with what COVID has meant to us over the last year and a half. This has been part of what's quite necessarily been a healing process. And so what we're going to talk to you about today is really more the logistics and operations side of that healing process. I think recognizing that folks are in different spaces mentally, emotionally, as well as physically and operationally is a big important part of this conversation. And so some of what we say does not generalize very well, but recognizing that there's still a lot of nuance to this conversation and that we're prepared to meet those little nuances. So they gave me the clicker. Yeah. Washington State University has a 12-point plan to mitigate COVID on all our campuses, and I'm pleased to announce to you all that the plan is working. The 12 points here are arranged loosely in order of importance, and when I say loosely, I want to emphasize that vaccination is by far the #1 most important point in this plan. As we look back over how we responded to COVID in the previous academic year, we relied quite heavily on some of the lower down bullet points. Cleaning, screening, testing, separating folks, getting people into quarantine, and obviously a more online and remote experience just to minimize the risk of exposure to one another. As the vaccine has become widely available, what we've seen is that this is the linchpin in being able to return to a full on-campus, in-person experience. And so every contact point that we have with a student, with a faculty or a staff member necessarily pivots back to a conversation around why vaccination is what enables us to be able to return to that feeling and actual experience of normal. That doesn't mean that the other things go away, because we know that not everybody is able to be vaccinated. And so important things like face coverings, social distancing where appropriate, structural and engineering controls like air ventilation, having the appropriate PPE available, all of these things are still very important in that chain of necessary items to maintain a safe and healthy on-campus in-person experience. And you'll see that all around you in this room. You still see the hand sanitizer, the wipes, the fact that we're all wearing masks and spread out a little bit more than we normally would have been 2 years ago. And I think that's very important. Calling attention to our contact tracing and identifying positive cases. I'm going to visit that again. Haley's going to, but we'll both talk about that later. But that is still an ongoing process because it's not just been a case of vaccinate and walk away. We're still very aggressively identifying students who are positive and have implemented a robust diagnostic screening testing program here on the Pullman campus specifically, while working with partner campuses to make sure students on each campus have access to testing. We've also, as part of the COVID operations group that the president mentioned, identified COVID coordinators functionally at the department levels so that we can answer those unique and nuanced questions that do come up as to how policy applies and how they can respond in individual areas as we put out new information, which, you know, happens just about every day. The risk calendar is an identification of those events which might put us at higher risk of a spike in cases because of congregate events, think large outdoor events, family weekend, that kind of thing, and so that we can proactively mitigate what we might anticipate to be a rise in cases 2 to 3 weeks after one of those events. And then finally, renewed outreach and communication. So we want to continue to build the relationships that we formed as a result of the pandemic response, really reach students, family, faculty, staff, and all WSU stakeholders where they are so that they understand what we're doing. So the reason I'm able to, I think, confidently tell you that this 12-point plan is working and why I'm excited to put vaccination at the very top is that our vaccination rates continue to climb. I'm going to show a slide for each campus, and I won't dwell too long on each one. I see you straining to read that number there, sir. And my printouts are in black and white, so Haley's going to hand me hers in color. The number on the very left is enrollment. The second one is number vaccinated. The third is percent compliant. And the fourth is the compliant vaccination percentage. Thanks, Haley. So,
Joel,
sir,
people are having trouble hearing you behind you, so can you speak up
gladly
just a little bit, maybe pull it a little closer?
Is that a little better?
I get some head shakes, yes. So.
All right, I can up the volume. I'll use my command voice. There you go. All right, how's that? So Advancing to the next slide, what you'll see is that overall compliance across different campuses varies somewhat, but that the percent vaccinated within the compliant group, that column all the way on the right, is quite high. Since we first started sampling vaccine rates among students in early July, that number has hovered between 92 to 94%. And when we had the employee attestation process through Workday, let's call that round one, that number did settle in around 94% as well. And when we look at the Pullman campus, where currently we have the largest N number here, it does seem to be settling right in around that happy percentage of about 94% vaccinated. Friday was the deadline for compliance in the general student body to submit their vaccine information or an approved exemption. And so we're still collecting stragglers and have an aggressive plan to track those down. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But for those that are interested in statistical sampling, I think probably the most pertinent group to look at is those who live in residence halls on the Pullman campus, because they had an August 6th compliance deadline. And as of this week, 96% of those students have complied with policy. And again, out of that group, they're coming in right in that 92 to 93% vaccinated rate. The reason this is really encouraging and why I would almost get up and do the happy dance here in this board meeting is because this puts us above the threshold for what we need for herd immunity. So this is exactly what we need when we plan for the in-classroom experience for events on and around campus, because it means we've crossed that mark of a significant vaccination rate. And I expect that as our marketing and communication folks start to reach out by text message, email, phone call, and even individual visits to round up those stragglers to make sure they comply with policy, that we will continue to hover right in around that 92 to 94% rate. For comparison, state of Washington in vaccinable adults, so 12 and up, it is a 75% vaccination rate. So I'm also proud to say that members of our WSU student community across the state are getting vaccinated at a rate, I think, significantly higher than that of the general population. I imagine you'll have questions on that, but I also want to provide some information about the number of COVID cases. And again, this is
Joel,
sir.
I want to stop you. I mean, I know it's great to run past that and we take it for granted and go to, well, here's some things we need to work on. But it's a remarkable number. And I know you'll show where we were a year ago on cases, but we are now near the end of week 4 of classes. We've been able to do football games on campus. We're doing social events on campus. We had sorority and fraternity recruitment events. You know, you go through all this kind of stuff. And I'm just so proud of our students for taking this so seriously, and for our staff and people around campus that are encouraging it, just doing this. We could not be doing the things we're doing on campus right now without these kind of numbers. And it's after a year ago when, you know, I just shuddered opening the news in the morning to sort of see where we were and the New York Times list, whether we had fallen to, number 3 instead of number 1 around the country. This is a pretty remarkable turnaround. So a lot of people on campus work really hard, but our students have taken this really seriously, and I really appreciate that.
Yes, sir, absolutely. That is encouraging. And I think it actually gives me an opportunity to talk about the fact that WSU is really in the vanguard of COVID response nationally. We were invited by the White House to participate in their COVID challenge earlier this summer because they identified us as a front runner in the region for COVID planning and response. And admittedly, some of this is due to our academic calendar. So we start earlier, we get to figure this out earlier. But I think we are quite visibly leaders in the field of science and research. And among our cohort of land-grant universities, that folks are looking at us for the answers and how to do this right. And what the lessons we've learned over the last year, I think, demonstrate that we've figured it out in a way that's worked quite well for our different campuses to enable our students to return to that on-campus experience. We also have folks, I think, across the WSU system that are serving in key advisory roles, including with the American College Health Association, advising the Centers for Disease Control, and that are there at the table helping to make policy and to shape guidelines for institutions of higher education. So you're absolutely right, Mr. President. There are many things to get excited about, I think, when we look at those numbers, and that they're not just a statistic on the board. I think it also gives me an opportunity to call attention once again to the folks behind the scenes, just folks in IT, the ones that are visually verifying each one of those COVID cards that get uploaded, the people that really work to make all that come together. The phone calls that have been coming in have just been, the volume is staggering. And to be able to relate a pretty sweeping university policy down to the level of an individual person answering a phone that might be an upset or concerned parent or a curious student is no small lift either. And so once again, just want to throw that appreciation out to all of our folks. The slide that we have up here is sort of a then and now. So if you look at the period of time from 2020 compared to the same period of time this year, this is again just on Pullman campus. So data that I have a really good grasp on, and apologize that this doesn't transfer well to the other campuses. But here we can measure the effects of our mitigation response and see that the total number of cases has dropped significantly. I'll point out that this is actually encompassing of student and employee data. Right now, we only have 2 students living in sequester housing on the Pullman campus. Cougar Health Service has been averaging about 120 COVID tests per day since the beginning of the semester. We've been needing the student need for capacity on diagnostic testing, and our positivity rate over the last week has hovered in the 7 to 8% range. So even of that 120 students that are coming in every day for a COVID test, only about a dozen of them are testing positive for COVID. We no longer do screening testing. Diagnostic testing, when I use that phrase, means people who are experiencing symptoms of COVID or have had a close contact with somebody with COVID. The community at large, and that's not just in Pullman, but across the state of Washington, is experiencing severely constrained resources when it comes to testing. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find any community where the public health system can support a screening approach. And screening is not really a tool that's in the kit anymore, and that's why it wasn't on the 12 points that we put up there earlier, because we are now only testing people who have symptoms or those close contacts. And that's, again, specifically because of the vaccine. This is actually very encouraging numbers. Again, in fact, a student journalist called me yesterday and said, hey, what should we do if we have a cold symptoms? Because now we know that if you're feeling sick, it's not COVID anymore, which is sort of an astute observation, because those other 100 and some students that are getting tested every day do indeed have a cold or strep or allergies and that kind of thing. And that's one of those medical returns to normalcy that I'm quite glad to see. But we're still encouraging them quite aggressively to go get tested if they have symptoms at all, and to keep them out of the classrooms and to follow all the proper protocols. Any questions on that? I want to pivot from that quickly. As I mentioned, we're meeting the student needs for testing, for vaccination. We continue to vaccinate every week at Cougar Health on the Pullman campus. As I mentioned, we've been working with the other campuses to make sure students have access to testing in their communities, that they have access to get the vaccine, because we don't want to tell them to go get the shot and then hear back that the shots are unavailable. Vaccines have been widely available. Access to care is severely constrained. And for those who've been watching the articles in the media over the last few weeks, I think you mentioned that we were in the New York Times about a year ago for bad reasons. The region, I think, is constrained severely right now, and found ourselves in the New York Times again because of the healthcare system in Spokane. And some of you folks saw that article, but being a border town and being next to a state where vaccination rates are almost half what they are in our state is putting quite a crunch on the ability of hospitals and intensive care units to handle the influx of COVID patients. And that does have sort of a spillover effect into the rest of the healthcare community. And Cougar Health and our other campus health units have not been immune from that, if you'll pardon the pun. Healthcare in general is experiencing extremely high rates of burnout and some of the same staffing crunches that we're seeing across the board in other industries. So when you think about how difficult it is to open a restaurant right now or to deliver the mail on time, that is also happening in the medical world. And so I do want folks on the board to be aware that while we're currently meeting student needs, it is not without significant and measurable cost. And I do want to honor the fact that there's a lot of folks out there who've been in the front lines, again, in many ways, shapes, and forms, whether it's cleaning rooms or answering phones or putting a stethoscope on somebody's chest. But they've been doing that for 18 months, and that takes a heavy toll. So it's with a large amount of pride that I'm able to say I've been able to serve with those folks over the last 18 months. But the good numbers that we see in front of you today have been hard fought for. And I'm quite optimistic that we'll continue those trends, but we'll have to pay, I think, a very close eye to the physical and mental health of the folks that are doing that work. So with that dour note, I'll turn it over to my colleague Haley to talk a little bit more about enforcement and some of the policy and some of the work that we're doing on the back end, specifically regarding the vaccine.
Just before we jump to that, a couple questions. How is our greater Pullman community responding to, obviously this mitigation and their comfort level? And then, just from a hospitalization standpoint, how is that looking and feeling, knowing that, every hospital is pushed to its capacity at the moment?
Certainly. We're in frequent communication with our colleagues here in local healthcare. We have several weekly phone calls, and we've had very recent conversation about how to meet the testing needs of the community writ large. The hospital has been very responsive to that, and I'm confident that we'll be able to work together as a team, as a community, to meet that need. But it's pretty tight. I know that as of about 2 weeks ago, the last time I saw a report on bed capacity at PRH, and I don't want to speak fully confidently for them because I'm not a representative of Pullman Hospital, but they were at or near bed capacity, and most of those patients were transfers. They were all unvaccinated. So that mirrors the story that I think you're hearing from other larger hospitals in the region and across the state, that we'll continue to see the strain on resources coming from unvaccinated folks. And that if we experienced a prolonged spike because of Delta, that specifically it becomes a disease of the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated.
And one thing I would just add to that is our environmental health and safety staff are actually doing all of the contact tracing for Whitman County right now because Whitman County Public Health is strapped. And what they're seeing is that if you look on Whitman County Public Health's website, they actually have a chart with all the communities in the area, and Pullman's low comparatively. If you rate the populations at the same level, obviously it's a lot of small towns, but we're seeing it spread in unvaccinated families, not in Pullman. So we've been working a lot with the community. Obviously last fall was a little stressful. And I think we've made, thanks to a lot of the work that Cougar Health is doing, we've made a lot of strides in building that community relationship in terms of health. And they're seeing our students aren't causing that same burden on the healthcare system that we saw last fall.
Yes, ma'am. It's a lower share of the overall population by case than we make up as individuals. So it's specifically because of the high vaccination rate among WSU stakeholders.
Okay, so my name is Haley Rupp. I use she, her pronouns, and Joel got to do all the fun, happy numbers, and so now I get to get into policy, so I apologize. But as Joel mentioned, our number one mitigation tactic is this vaccination requirement, and I'm going to get into a little bit of the details of how that's working. So all students and employees system-wide are required to provide proof of COVID-19 vaccination, and we do actually have to see proof of that vaccination. It's not just an attestation, or have an approved medical or religious exemption. And those, I'll get into the process for those, but when Joel's talking about compliant populations, he means that they've met one of these three categories. So the exemption process has changed rapidly, I would say, over the last couple of weeks. To Joel's point, WSU starts before anybody else, so we get to be the guinea pigs in figuring out how to apply all of these different regulations coming out of the state. But I will say we've done a really phenomenal job. If anyone is a fan of the TV show Friends, pivot is our word for the semester. So for our medical exemptions, it's pretty straightforward. Whether you are an employee or a student, you have to have a note from a licensed healthcare provider. The category for what qualifies as a licensed healthcare provider is slightly different for students versus employees, but along the same lines. And then the difference there too, and this applies for religious exemptions as well, is for employees, if they need a medical accommodation, and this would be outside of COVID as well, is can they still do their job without causing an undue burden to the university. So that's something that our HRS folks evaluate. So for instance, if someone was a truck driver, we just got this example in our meeting this week, and lost their driver's license, it would be sort of impossible for them to do their job. But if they just needed a stool so that they could get into their truck, that's a reasonable accommodation that the university could provide. For the religious exemptions, it's quite a bit more complicated. We do want to ensure that any student or employee who is filing for a religious exemption has a sincerely held religious belief. And so there's a series of questions that was developed by our state attorney general's office that we ask each person filing a religious exemption to fill out, just answering questions about the nature of their religion, how long they've held that, why it conflicts with the vaccine requirement. And then those go to a panel. So for employees, there's a separate panel, and then students, there's also a separate panel. We do have some overlap, and both those panels are advised by our same assistant attorney generals. We're not, those panels are not responsible for determining if a person is religious or not, but just that religious belief is in fact sincerely held. And then we respond to the student or the employee with the results of the panel review. Again, this falls into the undue burden for employees. So if for some reason they were working in a setting where they would not be able to be masked or something like that, then that's a different conversation that HRS reviews with them. But for students, it really is, if they file a religious exemption, it's determined to be sincerely held, then that religious exemption is granted. I'll talk a little bit about enforcement as well. So as Joel, Kirk, go ahead.
You might also mention about the blind review on the religious exemption.
Yes, that is a good point. So particularly for the initial review, we are doing a blind review. So we're de-identifying the information that we receive as much as possible. There may be instances where if the committee determines that they need more information in a certain area, they will go back to that individual. But the initial review, we do our best to de-identify it just to avoid any sort of bias. On the enforcement side of things, as Joel mentioned, the deadline for students was September 10th, and that was to be compliant with the first vaccination requirement, which required that they either had a proof of vaccination or, at the time when we first announced it, a personal, medical, or religious exemption. So when the Pfizer vaccine received full FDA approval, we did remove that option for a personal exemption, and we are communicating with those students that they now either need to get vaccinated or have a medical or religious exemption on file with us and approved. And we've extended that deadline for that small cohort to October 18th, which matches the same deadline for all of our employees. For employees, it's pretty straightforward. On October 19th, if you are not compliant with this requirement, you can no longer work for the university. Now, depending on your contract, it doesn't mean you're immediately fired. It does mean, however, that you cannot be in a working status and you will be entered into the appropriate termination protocol. So some, like faculty, it's very different. They have contracts, they have a review process they have to go through. It's not an immediate you're out. But we also have, because the requirement out of the governor's office said that you must be fully vaccinated, that means 2 weeks after that second dose. So we will be working with employees who maybe are only 1 week past their second dose. So they will not be able to work, but they potentially could then come back into employed status once they've met that requirement. So and then student employees, any student employee not compliant would just be immediately terminated. And that goes for any sort of temporary employees. For students, we will be placing registration holds on all non-compliant students. So they will not be able to register for spring semester courses. We've dubbed them Team Pester and Annoy, and they have started a communication campaign with all non-compliant students. So that involves email, texting, and as we now approach closer, well, now we're past the deadline, we're actually going to start a phone call campaign. So we've seen that a lot of those students actually were, when we sent them a text, they said, "Oh, thanks, I forgot." So we don't think that it's actually students who are avoiding the vaccination requirement, just not sure where to submit their information, what the process is, et cetera. So we've had really good interactions with that. I think the first text message that went out garnered 1,200 vaccination records. So it's truly just a reminder that you need to do this as soon as possible. So, and that annoying campaign is happening across the system. So we're working with all our marketing and communications folks. Sure.
One question in the middle of that. So along the pester and annoy line of thinking, is the blind review of the religious exemption, is that final, or is someone appeal that? Where would we go legally on that?
For students, if they want to appeal their process, we actually enter them into that same appeal process that exists for all student conduct. So they work with the dean of students for Pullman or for the vice chancellor of student affairs on their campus. And it can be a lengthy process. And we have warned students that, appealing your decision is not going to remove your hold. And so it may be quite delayed. For employees, it's a little bit different. And I don't know that I could honestly speak to what that process looks like, because that's a different set of legal requirements. So.
Time for Q&A too. So probably another 5 minutes and then.
This is actually my last slide.
Oh,
so
great.
Yeah, we're good to take questions.
So I have a question. Certainly as an employer of 600 people, we at STCU are working through some of these interesting nuances and the vagueness around a religious exemption in particular. I think people thought, oh my gosh, this is great. Here's kind of a really good tool that we can use to yay or nay on this, and certainly finding that not to be the case. Sincerely held is a pretty open-ended. So what are some of those things that the Attorney General's office is providing as criteria to truly determine sincerely held? I mean, that is just a tough position for any employer to be in.
Yeah, I would say, it's erring on the side of approval. Truthfully, because it's a subjective thing. It's hard to determine. And that's why we brought in a whole committee. And for the student side, they have a background in different cultures and religions and things like that. But to your point, Chair Dickinson, it is, there's not a good, this is yes, this is no. So we have gotten some general guidance because they went through different court cases with us as far as what had been approved in the past. There's questions about whether veganism counts as, a religious belief, and in some court cases it can. So, yeah.
I say that because I think for the Board of Regents, just to have awareness and clarity in understanding that this is very, very gray. And if you are an employer that is accepting these religious exemptions, I have been part of a panel looking at them the last week, and it's really, really difficult, and it's pretty slippery slope.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate the blind piece. I actually took that back to our own company and put that together, having talked to Kirk, because that has allowed us. But on the cases in which you decline, those are going to be interesting ones, right? That are going to come back. And we as a university have to be prepared to know how to navigate them. Questions? I can't say enough about where we were a year ago and are at a Regent meeting on a Zoom call, and just feeling really sad for just our university and for some of the press that we were getting. I think we have an opportunity here. The elephant in the room, as we all know, is several things around those that are perhaps opting to follow the governor's mandate. And recognizing that we have to afford everybody, regardless of the position that they may serve in the university, you are faced with having to kind of look at that equally across the board. And so we'll continue to monitor that. I just want to be on record as the chair to say, the work that's been done here is remarkable. The messaging that should be making the news is that the White House has asked WSU to come and lead and help other community or other institutions look at the way we do this the right way. And it is unfortunate that it is our brand is being somewhat tainted right now by decisions that are not in alignment with where the university is trying to move to and the actions we have taken. So, we will continue to work through that on all cases. And just thank you very, very much to both of you. That is not an easy job, and we are very appreciative of it. Comments from the Regents? Anything else that we want to talk about here before we move on?
I had a question. What do you know, like the percentage of employees that may be impacted by the October 19th deadline? I'm just curious, thinking ahead and what kind of implications that could have on filling roles or anything like that.
Right, classes, all those things. Good question, Shane.
I will say it not quite yet. I mean, anecdotally, we had a handful of individuals who, when that proclamation came out, did just submit resignations. I think at last count from HRS, we had about 3,800 employees who had already submitted proof of vaccination. I think there were about 1,800 who had not done anything. And so whether they're working through a religious or medical accommodation or just deciding, HRS did recommend that all documentation be submitted by October 4th. So that people would have ample time to meet that October 18th deadline and hopefully not face any sort of penalty. But ultimately, I mean, we will have some individuals who will wait until the October 18th deadline and then choose to not be compliant with that mandate. And that is something I think all of our units are actively working on.
I believe I read that starting in October, admission to the football games is going to be by proof of vaccination. What constitutes proof of vaccination? Do you have to show your original vaccination card, a facsimile thereof? It's sort of a confusing point.
So I don't know that athletics has finalized what that's going to be. I will say, like for the employee side of things, you have to either show your physical card, a digital copy of your card, or a state immunization record. Okay. And that's typically what we've seen for larger events in the state.
I'll point out too that proof of a recent negative test was part of that announcement. So within 72 hours of the event, and I know from some conversations with Department of Athletics that they'll be working with community resources to offer that testing in advance of any large events. As I mentioned earlier, the capacity for the community to handle any additional testing right now is severely limited. And so when you add in, even if we do a rough estimate of 5 to 10% of folks who don't have the vaccine but want to go to an event, that might need to demonstrate a negative test. That's several hundred tests that we add to the community within 72 hours before an event. So believe you me, we've had that conversation about how we might be able to pick up that slack and make sure that we can still have those events as planned.
Yeah, especially when you're not doing screen testing, right? Like that's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't know. We'll wrap the conversation up here with a thank you. And I just recently, it's an interesting article to read and podcast to listen to around Amy Cuddy. And she speaks of the pandemic flux syndrome. And it is not a deemed scientific syndrome, but it's really very interesting and something worthwhile. She does a podcast with Brene Brown as well, but just the various phases of crisis, and then to kind of be sitting in regression to some degree where we've kind of slid backwards, and then, trying to kind of rebuild out. And so I just thought it might be an interesting tidbit for, for people like you guys who are dealing with this day in and day out. I have empathy for you. I do it myself in a different job in a different place, and it's hard work. And some days you just don't want to have to figure out staffing levels and quarantining of your employees. So thank you very much. Great conversation. Glad to have you here. Okay, I am going to turn it over to Provost Chilton to be giving us her report here on reflection and horizon.
Thank you, Marty. I think I'll just wait for the slides to get up, but just say that I'm hoping to give just a high-level update on some of the activities from academic affairs. And I just, these are the 4 things I'd like to touch on. COVID response only in terms of what we learned in terms of innovation for supporting our students and our faculty, the work on the Executive Budget Council, DEI efforts, and one WSU implications for and activities for academic affairs. So first of all, in terms of the innovations, we always try to learn from great challenges. And in this case, COVID provided lots of challenges, and we made a number of pivots in order to support our students over the past year, many of which will continue in some form. First of all, many of you know we changed our spring academic calendar. We started a little later, and we eliminated our spring break, and then we scattered 3 midweek semester breaks where classes would not be taught, but the university offices were open. And these decisions were made to reduce the spread of COVID, of course, but also to acknowledge the need of breaks for students and for faculty. And of course, these changes were not appreciated by everyone, but we kept our spring caseload low. We did not see some of the big spring break surges that many other universities did. And I believe overall it was a successful change. Secondly, a computer loan program. My office worked with Information Technology Services to introduce a computer loan program, making many Acer Chromebooks available to students for their educational use. And we also partnered to provide students with access to Wi-Fi via hotspots, mobile hotspots. That was also a really helpful program, I believe, and students often sent them back at the end of the loan period with thank you notes saying how important it was for them to have this opportunity to have access to technology. Another innovation is that really following national standards, a lot of universities tried to figure out ways to make sure that students' academic success continued. We created a no record COVID grade that students could request towards the end of the semester, really recognizing that remote learning was very challenging for many students, trying to balance their other responsibilities. And also many of them did not have reliable access to internet or private study spaces or stable housing or family support and other resources. So we hoped that the idea was to alleviate some of the anxiety, and then as they got towards the end of the semester, they could request a no record COVID, which allows those courses to be excluded from calculations for federal and state financial aid, for example. Undergraduate and graduate students enrolled in courses for the fall and spring were eligible, and about 1,200 students across the system took advantage last academic year of this no record COVID grade. And then finally on this point for supportive students, really the pandemic spurred a renewed focus among all of our campuses on providing opportunities for dual enrollment. And that is because obviously we were teaching primarily remotely last year. And so it isn't as if a student in Vancouver wanted to take a class in Tri-Cities, they would necessarily have to drive there. And so we piloted a program and we learned a lot of lessons from this. We did have more students enrolling across campuses than we did the year before. But we also, now that we're primarily back in person, really need to help. We really need to continue to work on that, because now it's again more challenging, and some of it's financial, some of it's bureaucratic changes we need to make internally. But I know all the chancellors and I are really interested and continue to explore the opportunity as one WSU to let students enroll across the system in ways that suit them. So secondly, we also tried to learn from the pandemic and its challenges to better support our faculty. So first of all, using funding from Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds, the HERF funds, we awarded small grants to faculty to redesign their courses in order to increase engagement, especially for classes of more than 100. And Kirk and I talked about this a lot. As we welcomed students back to campuses in a more robust in-person experience, we sought to really highlight those high impact in-person practices that really make a difference, but at the same time, use learning technologies in ways that also are going to help them achieve their educational outcomes. And so some of the faculty selected for this worked with instructional design staff from academic outreach and innovation to redesign their courses. In other cases, undergraduate course learning assistants were hired to help instructors in some of these large enrollment courses in order to better connect with students and implement some of these high impact instructional practices. And then focusing more about our support for faculty, some of you, and I'm speaking to the Regents, have reached out and said, I'm reading nationally about burnout among faculty and faculty leaving or going on strike, and what are we doing to support our faculty? And so we did a number of things. This was something we were very concerned about, of course. First of all, we've always had a tenure clock extension process for all tenure track faculty, meaning if something happens, your lab was flooded or there was a personal crisis, one can always apply to have that tenure clock moved out a bit. And based on COVID, these challenges were much broader than typically we would see in a year. And so we really liberalized our process and made it clear that faculty could request, because of impacts on their research, their teaching, their lives, that they could request an extension of their tenure clock. So we had a number of faculty taking advantage of that. We also offered, though, faculty an opportunity to apply for modified duties for COVID with respect to dependent care. So, for example, it wasn't a leave, but perhaps a reduction in teaching load in order to take on other kinds of work that were more flexible in terms of timing, things like developing new teaching materials or greater attention to research or development of new curricula, for example, other accreditation. Also, we asked our department chairs and our deans to support flexibility in things like the days of the week that folks were teaching, or maybe even co-teaching classes with advanced graduate students. Just really asked everyone to be flexible in order to support our faculty in meeting them for their needs. And I think these obviously were COVID responses, but they're things that will live on as we continue to support our faculty and students moving forward. We asked department chairs also to conduct their annual reviews, especially for the last 2 academic years, using an achievement relative to opportunity approach, because as we know, travel has been limited for faculty conducting research and going to conferences. We also know that everyone has extra burdens on them. And so we really ask them in those annual reviews to be sensitive to the context that we're all in currently. And then finally, I did want to extend a hearty thanks to the Faculty Senate for initiating a change in the faculty manual that provides equity during a time when we thought we might need to impose staff furloughs or salary reductions. It came to our attention that the faculty manual did not allow for those for our tenure track faculty. And Greg Crouch spoke about this at our meeting in May, I believe. This process is really an option by which crisis precipitated budgetary burdens might be more equitably and justly met across the system. So I really do want to thank them for that. So I want to update you on the Executive Budget Council. This is one of the things when I was being hired last spring that Stacy Pearson mentioned would be a really important involvement for the new provost. And it was something I took on with great excitement, much to Kirk's puzzlement, I think. But Stacy Pearson and I co-chair the Executive Budget Council. And, I've said before that I sort of wish we called it the Strategic Budget Planning Task Force, because it has a limited charge, time limited, and the whole point is to link our allocation of resources to our strategic priorities. If I had to say in one sentence, that is the goal: looking at national best practices, better understanding our current budget picture, and then making recommendations for improvements. So last year we focused on the looking in the mirror and also looking at the landscape of higher ed. And in doing that, these are the guiding principles that our group, and I neglected to say we have about 15 members of the Executive Budget Council from across the system representing faculty, staff, and students. And I can send along the link to the list of all the members on the council. And so we came up with these guiding principles last year, just recognizing we wanted to be transparent. We want to make sure we're aligning resource allocation with responsibility, acknowledging the difference among our campuses, our colleges, and really making it a data-informed process. So this year we're moving into phase 2, where we've taken a look at ourselves in the mirror as we are. We've taken a look at the landscape, and now we're moving towards proposing specific changes to how it is we allocate resources and assess costs, because one of the key parts of this is to look at how we're allocating costs and not just the revenues. So this fall we'll be engaging across the system with faculty, staff, and students to present what we've learned thus far and work towards a recommendation. And some of the key attributes, I hope by the end of this academic year that we will have a proposal that we will give to the president and to the rest of the cabinet for consideration for implementation next year. But the key attributes of where we land will include, as I said, an alignment with strategic priorities, a greater degree of transparency than we currently have now in our budget allocation and cost allocation, that it will be data informed and not data driven, that there will be greater decentralization of both revenues and costs to be closer to where decisions are made that affect both of those, and a maintenance of system level and college level quality and excellence are all ideals that we're going to include very heavily in the model that we propose.
Question around that. So this is kind of the preparation and the allocation. Is there a thought process also around accountability for those individual colleges and throughout the university of who is maintaining to their budget and who's over budget, and understanding and having transparency in that as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. So assessment of revenues, costs, very careful attention and transparency in the bottom line, and then looking over time at how we can reduce those.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Maybe the other side of Chair Dickinson's comment. Is there an empowerment strategy allowing for decision-making once a budget's been put in place? So I love seeing budgets put in place. They become the constraints, the box that we work within, but then there's also, or can be, a real powerful opportunity when empowered to be able to utilize those guardrails to make good decisions.
Absolutely. That's the, the clear and more decentralized delegation of authority and responsibility for managing budgets within units is a key attribute of the kind of model that we're presenting. We don't have a concrete model to share with you today, and it's a good thing because Stacy's not here and she would be mad at me if I was presenting the detailed, but we don't have a concrete, we're looking at more of the principles we want to embody. I would suggest at a future Regents meeting that we give you an update, maybe even in November, to let you know where we've landed when Stacy is here, and if we have time on that schedule. Desiree's making faces at me over here. We could actually show you some of the mock-up models that we've gotten to embody some of these principles, if that's appropriate.
Elizabeth, on that note, can I just ask a question on the balanced scorecard? Will that be an outcome of the committee's work as well? With a focus on finance and budgets, you have sometimes unintended consequences, and
absolutely.
And so, how do you get to the vital few common metrics that provide balance to all the stakeholders involved?
Right. I mean, so we have a limited number of large pools of revenue that come in: tuition, fees, state allocation, and we have our core values as an institution, which are student success, faculty research, engagement and outreach. And so we're matching up the revenues as they're coming in, the costs that we bear, with what the core mission is of the university. In terms of the balance, I mean, I think we need to have a period. Stacy and I are planning to have any model have at minimum of a 3-year hold harmless period, because most units will need to have how do I put this, a subvention. Basically, if we were to model ourselves, and we haven't done this yet, I would dare say that you can't just have, okay, this is the proportion of tuition, here's your costs, you're on your own. That would be a true decentralized, responsibility-centered management. That would be the classic RCM that people talk about. We're not going in that direction because, as you say, it doesn't allow you to balance across. And in the end, we need to maintain that holistic quality. Many universities 20 or 30 years ago did this completely decentralized by college. Florida is a really good example. And it ended up that some colleges had lots of reserves, and some colleges were laying off tenured faculty because it was so decentralized. There was no sense of the whole, that central steering wheel of trying to maintain the university priorities as a whole. So we're not going to we're not going to propose such a decentralized budget that we would end up having really harm to some units, if that helps answer your question.
Elizabeth, we're just time-wise, we're
Yeah.
probably about 5 minutes.
Okay, so let me move on. I did want to touch on the strides we've made in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. In both the fall and spring semester, we hosted 2 virtual diversity, equity, and inclusion summits. These were spearheaded by Associate Vice President Jamie Nolan in Student Affairs. The fall summit focused on inequities exposed by the COVID pandemic. And in the spring, we had about a dozen topics for faculty, staff, and students, ranging from self-comfort and justice of care, first-generation students, furthering inequity and inclusion through the arts, removing barriers for students with disabilities, and many other topics. I'm also excited to announce our relatively new Associate Vice Provost for Inclusive Excellence, Dr. Lisa Guerrero, who assumed the role in December of 2020. She's already made great strides in her short tenure, most notably overseeing the Racism and Social Inequality in the Americas cluster hire, which I will discuss momentarily. And also joining our team is Tremaine Gaither, Special Assistant for Inclusive Excellence, who brings WSU leadership in mindfulness and anti-racism. And he's been conducting a number of trainings supporting the well-being of our faculty, staff, and students. We also have 2 new associate deans for equity and inclusion who joined our College of Education this summer. Catherine Rodella, who's an associate professor of educational leadership at WSU Vancouver. Amir Gilmore, assistant professor of cultural studies and social thought in education at WSU Pullman. And finally, Connors named Dr. Luz Maria Gordillo, a professor at WSU Vancouver, as the inaugural assistant dean for diversity, equity and inclusive excellence. I do want to touch on the racism and social inequality cluster. I talked to Jeanette and Enrique yesterday that this is one of the most exciting things that I've worked on over the past year. We initiated a faculty cluster hire in order to address system-wide needs for scholarship, teaching, and outreach aimed at dismantling systemic racism and to recruit and retain a more diverse faculty and student body. The goal is to create a cohort of scholars that are dedicated to research and teaching in these areas as a way to promote institutional transformation and foster diversity in recruitment, retention, scholarship, and teaching. So 5 faculty started this fall and provide a great deal of diversity in their research and exceptional teaching backgrounds. We have them listed here for the sake of brevity. I will not read them to you, but you can see we have representation at WSU Tri-Cities as well as Pullman and across 2 colleges in this initial cohort. For our second year of this, we received over 25 submissions from 8 colleges and 3 campuses, and we selected these 5 searches to move forward, focusing on health inequity and health justice in marginalized communities. These will be funded for the second cohort of the cluster hire. And the 5 lists that are selected are listed there across 3 colleges. And I look forward to introducing you to them next year. In the fall of 2023, we will focus on Native and Indigenous communities, and hopefully this cluster hire will continue in the years to come beyond that. I will not read these in the interest of time, but I will just say that some of you asked about how we were meeting the new state requirement to provide professional development and climate surveys to faculty, staff, and students who are working with student affairs. We did receive some state funds in order to offer a suite of trainings for faculty, staff, and students. And it'll allow us to conduct a national climate survey that's led by a collaborative at Harvard University so that we can really get at some of the demographic data that we've discussed at previous Regents meetings. We'll be able to have a more thorough assessment of climate. And finally, this is my last slide. You know, the other exciting project is our transition planning for 1WSU changes. And one of the most exciting projects, really, working closely with my colleagues in student affairs, research, international programs, and athletics on coordinating with these leaders and our transition team, which we have Haley Rupp, and her other hat is of many, is that she's the project manager of our transition team, working with Teresa Elliott Cheslick in Human Resources, Ginger Druffel in the President's Office, Chris Hoyt also in the President's Office, Christina Peterson-Wilson, my Chief of Staff, and Phil Weiler in Marcom. They're helping us to really work with each of these groups to really look at how these changes will be implemented smoothly and be able to be implemented by July 1st of 2022. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but I'm happy to take them if people do.
Well, what an exciting year plus you've had. And I really applaud many of the changes that were done last year and the new things coming down. I just love the cluster hire program, which is phenomenal, and this one WSU that I know you've worked on. Just a couple of comments and one question. As I think about the things that were implemented last year because of COVID, while COVID caused us a lot of trouble, it also gave us some great innovation. One of the things that a practice that was done each fall for the Regents that had to stop with COVID was that we were invited to have dinner with the women faculty group. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I heard over various times with them was for the tenure track faculty. One of their challenges was between teaching responsibilities, committees they were expected to participate in, and various other things going on. following that tenure clock was really a challenge. So I think that, the new practice of having opportunities to extend that clock under certain circumstances is a great thing. I'd also like to applaud and encourage the courses across campuses and being able to integrate that. Just a quick personally, my youngest daughter, it changed her life being able to, from Tri-Cities, to be able to take a course to Pullman. So, I mean, it's really a very powerful tool that can actually change the trajectory of students. My question is, and I thought about this when you were saying that there were, I think, over 1,000 students who decided they didn't want any grades last year. And as I think about, their entire experience, there's courses that it may not matter that much, but there's also curriculums where it does matter a lot. And being a scientist, I can really think in the science area. Are you going to be sort of following some of these students to make sure that they're going to be able to achieve the graduation requirements in a way so that when they go out into the marketplace and try to get jobs, they're not lacking something major because of this this COVID vacuum?
Yeah, and our academic advisors work with those students who made those decisions because in some cases, of course, it could have affected their graduation. In other cases, we were able to move them into another course. But our advisors are really at the forefront of helping each individual student really decide what's best for them. Is it better to take a lower grade, or is it a question that they're going to fail it? In which case that's going to hurt their GPA, et cetera. So I think really we did work with them one-on-one, but you're right that we need to figure out what the longer term effects are. We dealt with them on the short term effects, but it's a good point to make sure we're following them, making sure they have other options.
Thank you very much. Great reflections on that, and work that you have been very busy doing. So we will continue as a Board of Regents to obviously monitor, engage, and get updates on the One WSU and the steps that we'll want to be engaged and involved in. So thank you. Okay, we have two items just to touch base on briefly in preparation for tomorrow. One is a future action item, our 2023, can you believe we're actually saying that? Board of Regents meeting schedule, which you have in your packets. Any questions, concerns on those, in particular for Des at this time? Okay, and right, yeah, let's just, isn't that the truth? Okay, and then we have an action item that we'll be addressing tomorrow. If you recall, this past summer, we as a Board of Regents worked with President Schultz on his goals and objectives. And so we will be taking a vote on that tomorrow. However, I just want to turn it over to President Schultz. Any comments that you want to provide on those?
Yeah, we received feedback just during the summer through our conversation around this. There's really three things that we sort of modified that are slightly different than what you saw this summer. The first is they're organized around the university strategic plan. So they're specifically delineated in that particular way, because I think that's always a good question. If you talk about the strategic plan, am I, as president of WSU, and my goals and objectives aligned with that? So we wanted to make sure we delineated that. The second thing was folks felt that there needed to be a little more emphasis on marketing and what we were doing in terms of our branding of the university. And so we explicitly put more details in on that as we talk about that over the next year. And then the third thing that came back was, what are our learning experiences from COVID, and what are we going to do differently moving forward? And so we also incorporated that in there into one of the goals. So we try to take the feedback we got this summer, put those there, and that's what you see. And if you have, specific questions this time, happy to answer them, or, just in the hallway as we're doing this prior to tomorrow, if there's something else that you'd like to see me change, please just let me know, and I'm happy to do that. As a reminder, once you all, assuming that you approve these tomorrow, annually. I've done this for 13 years as president. I put them out to the university community because I want people to know what your expectations are of me. And I think they need to know what types of things I'll be working on as president during the upcoming year. So.
Questions for President Schultz on that? Okay, we are going to break here for lunch. We'll be reconvening at 1 o'clock into our committee meetings, and look forward to seeing all of you again tomorrow. Thanks. Thank you for all the presentations. Great morning.